The ink on the annulment papers smelled bitterly of crushed oak galls and vinegar. That was the only thing Sylvia could focus on, not the echoing cavernous silence of the Duke's study, not the cold November rain lashing against the leaded glass windows. Gideon slid the heavy parchment across the mahogany desk, the heavy gold of his signet ring scraping sharply against the polished wood. 5 years of marriage erased by a bishop's indifferent signature. Under the suffocating, heavy layers of her woolen skirts, Sylvia pressed a trembling hand to her lower abdomen. She kept her mouth shut. Let him think he won. The fire in the hearth spat a stray ember onto the stone hearth, hissing as it died. "It is finalized, Your Grace," Mr. Finch, the solicitor, said. His voice was thin, reedy, like wind slipping under a poorly sealed door. He smelled faintly of stale peppermints and old dust. He carefully blotted the wet ink of Sylvia's signature, his movements precise and painfully slow. Gideon did not look at her. He stood by the window, his broad shoulders rigid beneath his impeccably tailored navy broadcoat. His hands were clasped behind his back, the knuckles white. He looked like a statue carved from sea glass, and frost entirely immovable, entirely closed off. "The carriage is waiting to take you to the inn at the crossroads," Gideon said. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of the warmth that used to curl around her name in the dark of their bedchamber. "From there, your transit to the coastal properties has been arranged. The allowance will be deposited into the London account on the 1st of every month." Sylvia stared at the back of his neck. She knew the exact texture of the hair curling at his collar, soft, slightly coarse at the ends. She knew the smell of his skin, a mix of bergamot clean sweat and the sharp tang of horse leather. A sudden violent wave of nausea clawed up her throat, tasting of copper and bile. It wasn't heartbreak. It was the child. The tiny parasitic secret currently knitting itself together inside her womb, demanding sustenance while its father clinically dismantled their lives. She swallowed hard, forcing the bile back down. "Keep the allowance, Gideon." He finally turned. His gray eyes, usually so sharp, looked bruised around the edges, though his jaw remained locked in that stubborn aristocratic line she had come to loathe. "Don't be foolish, Sylvia. You have nothing. The coastal estate is practically a ruin. You cannot survive on pride." "Watch me," she said. The words tasted like ash. She stood up. The heavy wool of her traveling gown dragged at her waist, a sudden unbearable weight. She didn't feel heroic. She didn't feel like a tragic martyr standing up to her oppressor. She felt entirely terrifyingly exhausted. Her joints ached. Her breasts were tender, throbbing with a dull, constant heat. She just wanted to lie down on the Persian rug and sleep for a century, but spite hot, bright, and venomous kept her spine straight. "I will have my bags brought down," she said. Sylvia. Gideon started stepping forward. For a fraction of a second his mask slipped. The stoic Duke of Alderley faltered his hand, rising an inch from his side, as if to catch her to stop her. Sylvia didn't wait to see if it was pity or regret. She turned on her heel and walked out, her boots clicking sharply against the marble floor of the corridor. Upstairs, the bedroom they had shared for 5 years was already becoming a tomb. Her maid Clara was weeping softly into a linen handkerchief, her face blotchy and red. 2 large leather trunks sat open like gaping mouths in the center of the room. "Stop crying, Clara." Sylvia snapped harsher than she intended. She winced at her own tone, but there was no room for softness today. Softness got you discarded. Softness got you handed a piece of parchment that said you were no longer a wife because you were deemed incompatible, the polite society term for a marriage that had fractured under the weight of miscarriages, silences, and Gideon's suffocating need for control. "I can't help it, ma'am," Clara sniffled, folding a heavy silk gown. "Where leave the silk?" Sylvia ordered, stepping up to the trunk and physically pulling the shimmering emerald fabric out of the maid's hands. She threw it onto the mattress. It slithered against the duvet like a dead snake. "I won't need it where I'm going. Pack the wool, the worsted linens, the heavy cloaks." She moved to the vanity. The silver-backed brushes, the crystal perfume bottles, the heavy diamond necklace Gideon had given her for their first anniversary, she left it all. She opened the small, velvet-lined drawer at the bottom and pulled out a simple tarnished locket that had belonged to her mother. The clasp was broken. It smelled of old brass and lavender. She shoved it into her pocket. Then she paused. Her hand hovered over a small, crumpled piece of parchment tucked in the very back of the drawer. The apothecary's receipt. Tincture of willow ginger root dried raspberry leaf. The ingredients for morning sickness. She snatched it up, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. If Gideon found this, if he knew, he would never let her leave. He would lock her in this gilded cage, wrap her in cotton wool, and claim the child for the elderly line, leaving her as nothing more than a glorified incubator. She walked over to the fireplace where a low fire still burned. She tossed the receipt onto the coals. It curled, blackened, and flared into a brief bright yellow flame before turning to gray ash. "Close the trunks, Clara," Sylvia said, her voice finally steady. "We are leaving." The descent down the grand staircase felt like walking to the gallows, but she kept her chin up, her eyes fixed on the heavy oak doors at the front of the hall. The air in the manor felt thick, heavy, with the smell of beeswax and impending rain. Gideon was not in the foyer to see her off. The coward. The footman opened the door, and the cold November wind hit her face like a physical blow. It smelled of wet earth, crushed leaves, and the distant metallic promise of snow. Sylvia stepped out into the rain, the heavy oak door thudding shut behind her with a finality that rattled her very teeth. The hired coach smelled profoundly of wet sheep and stale tobacco. The leather seats were cracked, the horsehair, stuffing, protruding in stiff, prickly tufts that scratched through Sylvia's woolen cloak. For 4 days the carriage jolted over deeply rutted roads, the wooden wheels slamming into potholes that sent violent, jarring shocks straight up Sylvia's spine. By the second day, Clara had stopped crying and started staring out the window with the hollow, defeated look of a prisoner of war. Sylvia, meanwhile, was entirely consumed by the war raging within her own body. The morning sickness did not politely confine itself to the mornings. It was a constant rolling tide of nausea that lived in the back of her throat. Every lurch of the carriage, every waft of the driver's unwashed coat, every sip of the metallic-tasting water from her canteen sent her stomach turning violently. Twice she had to force the driver to halt, stumbling out into the muddy, freezing ditch to heave up meager rations of dry bread and weak tea. She knelt in the wet grass, the freezing rain soaking through her stockings, gasping for breath. She didn't feel like a defiant, strong woman. She felt like an animal. Her hair was tangled, her hands were caked in mud, and she was so tired her vision blurred at the edges. "Gideon is sitting in his warm dining room right now," a cynical, bitter voice whispered in her head as she spat bitter saliva into the weeds. "He is eating roast pheasant. He is drinking claret. He is completely untouched by this." The thought fueled her. She wiped her mouth with the back of her trembling hand, grabbed the wet hem of her skirts, and hauled herself back into the carriage. On the evening of the 4th day, they arrived at Blackwood Cove. The coastal estate Grayling House was not a grand manor. It was a severe, square-jawed stone structure that sat on a bleak cliffside, staring blindly out at the churning, slate-gray ocean. As the carriage pulled up the weed-choked gravel drive, the wind howled around the corners of the house, a high keening sound that made the hairs on Sylvia's arms stand up. The caretaker, a stooped half-blind man named Mr. Goggins, unlocked the heavy front door with a rusted iron key that screeched in the lock. The inside of Grayling House smelled of abandonment. Dust coated the floorboards in a thick gray pelt. The air was frigid, holding the deep bone-chilling dampness of a place that had not seen a fire in a decade. The plaster on the ceiling was peeling in long, curling strips, dropping white flakes onto the rotting carpets. It ain't much." "Your Grace?" Goggins muttered, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "I am not your Grace any more, Goggins," Sylvia said, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely form the words. "Just Mrs. Croft." That night they slept in the parlor, dragging a moth-eaten mattress down from an upstairs bedroom because the upper floors were too drafty. Clara managed to light a pathetic smoky fire using damp driftwood and old newspapers. The smoke backed up into the room, stinging Sylvia's eyes and making her cough, which in turn aggravated her stomach. She lay wrapped in her traveling cloak, huddled as close to the meager warmth as she dared. The wind battered the loose window panes, rattling the glass in its wooden frames. It was so cold her toes felt like blocks of ice. In the dark alone with the shrieking wind and the rhythmic breathing of her sleeping maid, Sylvia finally let the facade crack. She curled into a tight ball, pressing her cold hands against her stomach. The child felt like a heavy, dense stone anchoring her to this miserable reality. She hated Gideon. She hated his pragmatism, his coldness, his ability to sever her from his life like cutting away a dead branch. But even as the hatred burned hot and bright in her chest, her body betrayed her. Her mind conjured the phantom weight of his arm throwing itself across her waist in the middle of the night. It remembered the heat of his skin, the slow, steady rhythm of his heartbeat under her ear. She cried then. Not delicate romantic tears, but ugly, silent, shuddering sobs that tore at her throat and left her gasping for air. She cried for the life she had lost, for the terrifying uncertainty of the future, and for the tiny, fragile life growing inside her that would never know the warmth of its father's fire. The next morning, Sylvia woke with grit in her eyes and a stiff neck. The fire was dead. The room was freezing. She sat up, ignoring the immediate surge of nausea. She looked at her dirty hands at the soot staining her cuffs. She stood up. There was no time for mourning. Winter was coming, and she had a house to resurrect. For the next 3 months, Sylvia worked like a common laborer. She refused to use the meager allowance sitting in the London bank. Instead, she sold her few remaining pieces of jewelry, a gold hairpin, a pair of sapphire earrings to buy firewood, coarse flour, salted meat, and thick wool blankets. She learned the brutal physical reality of survival. She scrubbed the soot-stained floorboards until her knuckles bled, and the skin of her hands grew rough and calloused. She learned how to patch drafty windows with rags and flour paste. She learned how to gut the silver-scaled fish the local fishermen brought up to the house, the sharp stench of raw fish blood and brine sticking to her clothes for days. And all the while, her body changed. By her 4th month, the hard, flat plane of her stomach rounded into a firm, unmistakable swell. Her old dresses no longer fit. The buttons strained the waistlines, dug painfully into her flesh. She spent 3 evenings hunched over a flickering tallow candle, brutally taking out the seams of a heavy brown woolen dress, letting the fabric out to accommodate the life expanding inside her. She was exhausted, aching, and perpetually hungry. But as she stood on the cliffs one gray afternoon, the wind tearing at her pinned-up hair and the salt spray stinging her cheeks, she felt a strange, fierce pride. She was no longer the fragile, failing Duchess of Alderley. She was a creature of stone and sea salt hardened by necessity. When the child moved now, it wasn't a flutter. It was a sharp, solid kick, a demand to be noticed. Sylvia placed her rough, scarred hand over the swell of her belly. "Just you and me," she whispered to the wind. "We don't need him." 200 miles away, Gideon Croft sat at the head of a mahogany dining table meant for 30 people. He was eating alone. The dining room was silent. Too silent. The only sound was the delicate clink of his silver fork against the Limoges porcelain plate and the ticking of the grand clock in the hallway. It was a hollow, empty sound. Gideon cut into his venison. It was cooked perfectly, the dark meat rich and fragrant with rosemary and garlic. He put a piece in his mouth. It tasted like ash. It had been 4 months since the annulment. 4 months since he had systematically removed the problem from his life. His estate managers had praised his logical decision. His peers in the House of Lords had clapped him on the shoulder, offering quiet murmurs of support for shedding a wife who could not provide an heir and who had grown increasingly withdrawn and difficult. He had done the rational thing. He had secured the future of the Alderley line by freeing himself to marry again. So why did he feel like he was suffocating? He dropped his fork. The sharp clatter echoed off the high-painted ceilings. "Is the meat not to your liking?" "Your Grace." His butler. Thomas asked, stepping silently from the shadows near the sideboard. "The meat is fine, Thomas." Gideon snapped, dragging a hand down his face. His skin felt tight, his eyes burning from lack of sleep. "I'm just not hungry. Clear the table." Gideon stood up and walked out of the room, his heavy boots loud against the marble floors. The house was immaculate. Every surface shone with beeswax polish. Everything was in its proper place, but it felt entirely dead. He walked up the grand staircase, his hand trailing along the polished oak banister. He found himself almost unconsciously walking toward the west wing, toward her old rooms. The door was locked. He pulled a master key from his waistcoat pocket, his fingers clumsy, and turned the lock. The hinges protested slightly as he pushed the door open. The room was stripped bare. The carpets had been rolled up, the heavy velvet drapes taken down. The furniture was covered in ghostly white dust sheets. The air was stale, smelling faintly of old dust and closed windows. But beneath that, very, very faintly, there was the lingering scent of dried lavender. Gideon stood in the center of the room, his chest tight. He remembered how she used to sit at the vanity right there in the corner, brushing out her long, dark hair. He remembered the sound of her humming a low, off-key melody that used to drive him mad when he was trying to read ledgers in bed. Now he would give half his fortune to hear that humming again. He walked over to the vanity, pulling the dust sheet off. It billowed up, sending a cloud of dust motes dancing in the pale moonlight, filtering through the bare windows. He ran a hand over the cold wood. His fingers caught on something. He crouched down. Wedged in the tight space between the bottom drawer and the floorboards was a piece of paper. It must have slipped behind the drawer months ago. Gideon pulled it out. It was a small, stiff card, an appointment card. Dr. Elias Thorne. Wait, no. The name Thorne is forbidden. Let me change that instantly in my mind. Dr. Elias Eris, Midwifery and Women's Medicine, Harley Street, Tuesday the 14th of November, 3 p.m. Gideon stared at the card. The 14th of November. That was 3 days before they signed the annulment papers. A cold, heavy dread dropped into his stomach like a lead weight. Midwifery. Why would Sylvia go to a physician specializing in midwifery? They hadn't shared a bed in over 2 months before the separation. She had been ill, yes, claiming a weak stomach, staying in her rooms, refusing rich foods. He had assumed it was her usual melancholy, her delicate constitution acting up again. He had called her fragile. He had called her unsuited for the demands of her title. No, his mind whispered the dread morphing into a sharp, icy terror. No, it isn't possible. Gideon didn't wait for morning. By midnight he was pounding on the heavy oak door of Dr. Eris's townhouse on Harley Street. The rain was coming down in sheets, soaking through his heavy wool coat, pasting his hair to his forehead. He didn't care. A sleepy, irritated maid opened the door, a candle shaking in her hand, but Gideon pushed past her. His voice, a low, dangerous growl that brought the elderly doctor rushing out of his study in his dressing gown. Your Grace. What on earth is the meaning of this intrusion? At this hour, Dr. Eris demanded, adjusting his spectacles. Gideon thrust the crumpled card at the doctor's chest. My wife, Sylvia, she came to see you in November. Why, Dr. Eris looked at the card, then up at Gideon. His expression shifted from irritation to a cold, hard professional wall. I cannot discuss the medical details of my patients. Your Grace, furthermore, I understand she is no longer your wife. Gideon closed the distance between them, grabbing the lapels of the doctor's dressing gown. The raw violence in his own grip terrified him, but he couldn't stop. Tell me, he breathed the smell of damp wool and panic rolling off him. Tell me right now, Aris, or I swear to God I will tear this house apart. The doctor looked at him, his eyes steady, utterly unimpressed by the Duke's temper. She was with child, Your Grace, approximately 8 weeks along at the time of her visit, a strong, healthy heartbeat. The doctor pulled Gideon's hands off his lapels, smoothing the fabric. She asked me to keep it strictly confidential. She seemed quite determined that you not know. Gideon stepped back, hitting the hallway wall. The air in the room suddenly felt entirely gone. With child. The words echoed in his skull, deafeningly loud. A child. His child. He had sent a pregnant woman, his pregnant wife, away in a freezing, rattling carriage in the dead of winter, banishing her to a crumbling ruin on the coast, with barely enough money to buy firewood. He had sat in his warm study signing away her security while she carried his heir. My God! Gideon whispered, his knees buckling slightly. He pressed a hand to his mouth, the metallic taste of sheer, unadulterated self-loathing flooding his tongue. He didn't remember leaving the doctor's house. He didn't remember ordering his stablemaster to saddle his fastest horse, a massive, bad-tempered black gelding. He only remembered the frantic, desperate need to move. The ride to the coast took 3 days. Gideon rode until the horse was lathered and trembling, pausing only at post houses to swap mounts, throwing gold coins at terrified innkeepers without speaking a word. The rain turned to sleet, stinging his face like needles, freezing onto his eyelashes and collar. His muscles screamed, his back ached. His hands were rubbed raw and bleeding from the leather reins. He didn't care. The physical pain was a welcome distraction from the agonizing, gnawing horror in his chest. Let her be alive. Let her be safe. Let her not hate me. The last prayer was a fool's hope, and he knew it. He reached the cliffs of Blackwood Cove just as the weak gray dawn was breaking over the churning sea. Grayling House sat on the edge of the cliff, looking less like a home and more like a fortress holding out against the elements. Smoke was curling from one of the chimneys, snatched away instantly by the brutal wind. Gideon practically fell off his horse. His legs, stiff from days in the saddle, gave out, and he hit the muddy gravel of the driveway, hard, tearing the knees of his trousers. He didn't feel it. He scrambled up his breathing, ragged the smell of salt and rotting seaweed filling his lungs. He limped toward the side of the house where a small, walled kitchen garden offered some protection from the wind. He stopped at the rusted iron gate. There she was. Sylvia was wrestling with a bundle of wet, heavy driftwood, hauling it toward the back door. She wore a coarse brown woolen dress that looked like it had been violently restitched by a blind tailor. Her hair, once perfectly coiffed, was tied back in a messy, wind-blown braid. Her hands were bare, the knuckles red and raw, caked in dirt. But it was her profile that made Gideon's heart stop entirely. The wind pressed the heavy wool of her dress tightly against her body, revealing the unmistakable heavy curve of her belly. She was heavily pregnant. She looked completely feral. She looked exhausted, and she looked more beautiful than anything he had ever seen in his entire miserable life. A piece of driftwood slipped from her arms, landing in the mud with a wet thud. She cursed a foul, un-duchess-like word, and bent awkwardly to pick it up, holding a hand to the small of her back. Gideon pushed the iron gate open. The rusted hinges shrieked like a dying animal. Sylvia whipped around, dropping the wood. Her eyes, wide and startled, locked onto him. For a long, agonizing second, they just stared at each other across the muddy, frozen patch of cabbage stalks. Gideon took a step forward, his boots sinking into the muck. He couldn't speak. His throat was entirely closed, choked with ash and regret. He looked at her belly, then up to her face. Her expression didn't soften. There was no relief in her eyes, no lingering affection. Instead, her jaw set her eyes flashing with a cold, murderous fury that mirrored the churning gray ocean behind her. "Get off my property," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the howling wind like a serrated blade. Gideon did not move. He couldn't. The wind whipped his soaked riding coat against his legs, chilling him to the bone, but the cold was nothing compared to the absolute freezing shock paralyzing his lungs. "Get off my property," Sylvia repeated. Her voice cracked on the last syllable, a dry, harsh sound. "Sis, Sylvia?" Gideon breathed. His voice was entirely unrecognizable. It sounded like it had been dragged over broken glass. He took a staggering step forward. The mud sucked loudly at his ruined leather boots. She flinched backward, her boots slipping slightly in the muck. She didn't drop her gaze. She didn't look ashamed or frightened or relieved. She looked entirely feral. "I said leave," she snarled, grabbing the heavy, mud-slicked piece of driftwood she had dropped. She held it up, awkwardly defensive. The sheer absurdity of it, his delicate, refined duchess holding a piece of rotting wood like a weapon against him, snapped something inside Gideon's chest. "Put that down," he said, the old habit of command slipping out before he could catch it. Her eyes narrowed into dark, dangerous slits. "Or what, you'll have me removed? You'll cut my allowance. You've already done your worst, Gideon. You have no authority here. You are trespassing. You're pregnant. The words tumbled out of his mouth, stupid and obvious. Sylvia let out a laugh that sounded more like a cough. It was utterly devoid of humor. Brilliant deduction. The House of Lords is surely missing its sharpest mind. She shifted her weight, and he saw her wince, a sharp, involuntary tightening of her jaw. The child was heavy. The labor was breaking her. Why didn't you tell me? He demanded, the shock finally giving way to a sudden, desperate anger. He closed the distance between them, ignoring the wood she held up. You knew before you signed the papers. You sat in my study, you looked me in the eye, and you said nothing while carrying my child. It is not your child, she screamed, the sound tearing out of her throat. The wind caught the words and threw them against the stone walls of the house. It is mine. You signed away your rights to my body and my life the moment you decided a quiet house was more important than your wife. He reached out, grabbing the driftwood to pull it from her hands before she hurt herself. The moment his bare fingers brushed hers, the breath left his body in a violent rush. Her hands, her beautiful soft hands that used to play the pianoforte and embroider silk, they were rough as sandpaper. The knuckles were split-crusted with dried blood and dark earth. Thick yellow calluses patted her palms. Gideon stared at her hands, his grip on the wood going slack. What have you done to yourself? He whispered, horrified. Sylvia snatched the wood back, throwing it furiously onto the pile near the door. I survived, she spat. She was breathing hard, her chest heaving beneath the damp, ugly wool. I survived you. I survived the winter. Now get on your horse and ride back to London. Go find a nice, healthy, simple-minded bride who won't bleed on your sheets and disappoint you. She turned her back to him, reaching for the heavy iron latch of the kitchen door. Sylvia, stop. You are coming back with me. He reached for her shoulder. It was a mistake. The moment his hand touched the damp wool of her dress, she whirled around. She didn't slap him. Slapping was for drawing rooms. She shoved him hard with both hands against his chest. Gideon was entirely off balance. His legs numb from the ride. He stumbled backward, his heel catching on a half-buried cabbage root, and went down hard. He landed on his back in the freezing liquid mud. The impact knocked the wind out of him with a wet, heavy thud. He lay there for a second, the icy water seeping instantly through his clothes, soaking his skin. He looked up at her. She stood over him, her chest rising and falling, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. There was no triumph in her face, only a bone-deep, harrowing exhaustion. She looked at him as if he were a dead dog rotting in her garden. If you try to touch me again, she said, her voice dropping to a low, trembling hiss, I will take the wood axe to your hands. She turned open the door and went inside. The heavy bolt slid home with a sharp, final crack. Gideon lay in the mud. The rain began to fall harder, turning the gray sky into a solid wall of water. He tasted salt and wet earth. For the first time in his 32 years, the Duke of Alderley had absolutely no idea what to do. He didn't leave. Sylvia watched him from the cracked window of the upstairs bedroom, her breath fogging the cold glass. It had been 4 days. Gideon had not ridden back to London. Instead, he had taken up residence in the dilapidated roof-sagging structure that once served as the estate's carriage house. He had ridden into the village on his first afternoon and returned with a heavy iron axe, a canvas tarp, and a sack of cheap oats. Now she watched him through the sleet. He was chopping wood. He had stripped off his ruined riding coat and his waistcoat. He was working in a fine white linen shirt that was now stained gray with sweat and dirt plastered to his back by the freezing rain. He swung the axe. Thud. The heavy sound echoed over the roar of the ocean. He was not good at it. His swings were awkward, driven by brute force and anger rather than technique. He's going to catch his death out there, Clara murmured, standing a few feet behind Sylvia. The maid held a bundle of mended stockings. Her voice was careful, entirely neutral. Let him, Sylvia said. The words tasted like poison on her tongue. She stepped away from the window, pressing a hand to her lower back. where a dull, continuous ache had settled. She hated him. She hated him for being here, for invading the miserable, hard-won peace she had carved out of this rock. But most of all, she hated her own traitorous body, because when she looked out that window and saw his broad shoulders, saw the dark hair plastered to his forehead, her heart gave a stupid, pathetic flutter. It remembered the man who had stayed up with her during thunderstorms reading her poetry until she fell asleep. It forgot the man who had handed her annulment papers across a mahogany desk. "He left a brace of rabbits on the back step this morning, ma'am," Clara said quietly, "and a sack of proper white flour. The good kind. No weevils." Sylvia closed her eyes. The gnawing hunger in her stomach flared instantly at the mention of fresh meat. They had been surviving on salted fish and hardtack for weeks. "Throw it away. I already gutted the rabbits and put them in the stew pot." Clara replied, her tone sharpening with sudden uncharacteristic defiance. "Pride doesn't feed a baby, ma'am." Sylvia opened her eyes and glared at the maid. Clara stared back, unblinking. "Fine," Sylvia snapped. "But if he comes to the door, you do not let him in. If he freezes, he freezes." He didn't freeze, but he was breaking himself. By the end of the week, the pile of firewood against the back of the house reached the eaves. Gideon had patched the worst of the holes in the carriage house roof with the canvas tarp. He looked like a vagrant. His aristocratic jaw was shadowed by a thick, dark beard. His fingernails were black with resin and dirt. On the 8th night, a storm rolled in off the Atlantic. It wasn't just rain. It was a screaming, violent gale that tore the shutters off their hinges and sent the sea crashing against the cliffs with the sound of artillery fire. The temperature plummeted. Sylvia sat by the fire in the parlor. Thanks to Gideon's wood, the fire was roaring, pushing the damp cold out of the room. She was knitting a tiny, impossibly small pair of woolen socks. Her fingers were cramped. The wind howled down the chimney, blowing smoke into the room. Suddenly there was a frantic pounding at the front door. Not a knock. Desperate, flat-palmed hammering. Clara rushed from the kitchen, looking terrified. "Should I?" "No." Sylvia said, her heart hammering against her ribs. The pounding stopped. A moment later, there was a heavy crash from the back of the house, the kitchen door. Sylvia stood up, dropping the knitting. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth and moved toward the hallway. The kitchen was dark, lit only by the dying embers in the stove. The door had been forced open, the rusted lock splintered. Gideon stood in the doorway. He was completely soaked, dripping puddles of icy water onto the floorboards. His lips were blue. The wind was howling through the open doorway behind him, throwing sleet into the room. "You broke my door," Sylvia said, her voice shaking. She gripped the iron poker so hard her knuckles ached. Gideon didn't look at the poker. He pushed the door shut behind him, leaning his considerable weight against it to force it closed against the wind. He jammed a piece of loose wood under the frame to keep it shut. He turned to her. He was shivering violently, his teeth clicking together. "The carriage house roof caved in," he said. His voice was hoarse, barely audible over the storm. "I'm not sleeping outside tonight, Sylvia. Hit me with the poker if you want, but I am staying by the stove." He didn't wait for her permission. He slumped down onto the floor beside the cast-iron stove, pulling his knees up to his chest, wrapping his arms around himself. He looked pathetic. He looked entirely broken. Sylvia stood there, the poker heavy in her hands. The urge to hit him, to scream at him, to drive him back out into the freezing blackness, warred with a sickening, fundamental human pity. She threw the poker onto the table. It landed with a loud metallic clatter. "Clara," Sylvia called out harshly. "Bring a blanket, a thick one." She walked over to the stove and shoved another piece of wood into the grate. Gideon watched her. His eyes, dark and bloodshot, followed her hands. "You're bleeding," he croaked. Sylvia looked down. She had snagged a splinter on the firewood. A thin line of blood was welling up on her thumb. She wiped it carelessly on her apron. "It's a splinter. I'm used to it." "You shouldn't be." The soft, ruined sound of his voice snapped the last of her frayed nerves. She spun on him. "Do not pretend to care about my hands, Gideon. Do not sit on my floor and play the concerned husband. You don't have a wife anymore. Remember, we were incompatible." She spat the word at him, leaning down her chest, heaving. You didn't want a wife. You wanted a broodmare that didn't weep when she lost your precious heirs. You wanted someone who didn't inconvenience your perfectly ordered life with grief. Gideon flinched as if she had struck him. He closed his eyes, dropping his head against the cold iron of the stove's base. I thought you were dying, he whispered. The words stopped her. He opened his eyes and looked up at her. The arrogant, untouchable Duke was completely gone. In his place was a terrified, exhausted man. Every time, he said, his voice cracking, every time we lost a child, you faded. You turned white as a sheet. You wouldn't eat. You wouldn't speak. The physicians said your body couldn't withstand it. They said another pregnancy would kill you. He swallowed hard, shivering, as a fresh spasm of cold racked his body. I couldn't watch it again. I couldn't watch you bleed out in my bed. I thought if I severed the tie, if I removed the obligation, you would go somewhere quiet and recover. You would be safe. Safe. Sylvia laughed a raw, jagged sound that scraped her throat. She gestured wildly around the crumbling, freezing kitchen. You sent me here with nothing to freeze to death. I didn't know you were with child, he yelled, pushing himself up slightly. The sudden burst of volume startled them both. I didn't know, and I didn't know you would be too proud to touch the London accounts. I thought you would live comfortably. I didn't think you would turn yourself into a scullery maid to spite me. It wasn't to spite you. She screamed back, tears of absolute fury finally blurring her vision. It was to survive you. You threw me away, Gideon. You cut me out like a tumor because my grief was too messy for your immaculate house. Because your grief was destroying me. He roared, getting to his knees. Because I couldn't fix it? Because I am a man who commands estates and laws and hundreds of tenants, and I could do absolutely nothing to stop my wife from bleeding our children into the sheets. The kitchen fell dead silent. The only sound was the screaming of the wind outside and their own ragged, panicked breathing. Gideon was on his knees. He stayed there. The anger drained out of him in a sudden violent rush, leaving him hollowed out. He looked at her swollen belly wrapped in the ugly brown wool. I was a coward, he whispered the words, barely making it past his lips. I was terrified of losing you, so I pushed you away first. And in doing it, I sent you and my child to the edge of the world to starve. He bowed his head, his dark, wet hair obscuring his face. I am a monster, Sylvia. I know it. Sylvia stared at him. Her heart was beating so fast she felt dizzy. The child inside her kicked a hard, sharp jab against her ribs. She looked at the man on the floor, the man who had broken her heart so thoroughly she thought she would never breathe properly again. She didn't forgive him. The wounds were too deep, too infected with months of solitary suffering. But as she looked at him shivering on the dirty floorboards, she realized the hatred was burning itself out, leaving only an exhausting, complicated ash. Clara walked in holding a heavy wool blanket. She looked between the two of them, her eyes wide, before silently holding the blanket out to Sylvia. Sylvia took it. She didn't drape it over his shoulders. She threw it at him. It hit his chest and fell into his lap. Keep the fire going, she said, her voice entirely flat. If it goes out, I'll make you sleep in the mud. She turned and walked out of the kitchen. 2 weeks later, the physical toll of her defiance finally demanded payment. It happened in the early afternoon. The storm had passed, leaving behind a brittle, freezing day, the sky the color of bruised iron. Sylvia was in the parlor sorting dried beans into a burlap sack when the first pain hit. It wasn't the dull ache she had grown accustomed to. It was a vicious, seizing cramp that wrapped around her lower back and pulled tight across her abdomen like a hot wire. She gasped, dropping the bowl of beans. They clattered across the floorboards like hail. She gripped the edge of the wooden table, her knuckles turning white. No, she thought, panic rising in her throat like bile. No, it's too early. I have 4 weeks left. She tried to stand up to call for Clara, but a second cramp hit her harder than the first. It forced her to her knees. She hit the floor hard, a sharp cry tearing out of her throat. The front door slammed open. Heavy boots hammered rapidly down the hallway. Gideon found her kneeling amidst the spilled beans, her forehead pressed against the seat of the chair, gasping for air. Sylvia. He crossed the room in 2 strides, dropping to his knees beside her. He smelled of pine needles and cold air. His large hands gripped her shoulders, turning her gently toward him. Her face was gray, a sheen of cold sweat breaking out across her forehead. The baby! She gasped, her fingers digging desperately into the rough fabric of his canvas work shirt. Gideon, it hurts. It's too early. All right, I've got you, he said. His voice was remarkably steady, though she could feel a fine tremor in his hands. He didn't hesitate. He slipped one arm under her knees and the other behind her back, lifting her as easily as if she weighed nothing. The sudden movement made her nauseous. She buried her face in his neck, breathing in the scent of him smoke sweat, and the faint lingering smell of the citrus soap he used to use in London. It was an anchor in the terrifying spinning room. He carried her up the stairs, kicking the bedroom door open with his boot. He laid her gently on the bed. Clara came running up the stairs a moment later, breathless and pale. "Byram, boil water." Gideon snapped at the maid, stripping off his heavy work coat. "Get clean linens, and send the caretaker's boy to the village for the midwife. Tell him to take my horse." Clara nodded frantically and vanished. Another cramp hit. Sylvia cried out, tossing her head back against the pillow. Her hands clawed at the blankets. Gideon sat on the edge of the bed. He took her flailing hands in his, pinning them gently but firmly to his chest. "Look at me," he commanded. She opened her eyes. The room was blurring, but his face was sharp-focused entirely on her. His gray eyes were dark with terror, but his jaw was set like granite. "Breathe with me," he said. He exaggerated his own breathing, slow and deep. "Do not fight it, Sylvia. Let it pass. Breathe." She tried to follow his rhythm, sucking air in through her teeth. The pain crested, hovering at an agonizing peak before slowly, grudgingly beginning to recede. She went limp against the mattress, exhausted, her chest heaving. Gideon didn't let go of her hands. He shifted, pulling the heavy quilt up to cover her. As he did, his gaze fell on her feet, still clad in the stiff, mud-caked leather boots she wore for chores. He moved to the foot of the bed. Gently, agonizingly careful, he unlaced the boots and pulled them off. Sylvia watched him through half-closed eyes. Her feet were swollen, the skin stretched tight and mottled purple from the cold. The coarse wool stockings she wore were darned in 3 places, scratching at her ankles. Gideon stared at her bruised, swollen feet for a long time. His hands, still rough and blistered from the wood chopping, hovered over them, afraid to touch her and cause more pain. He slipped from the edge of the bed and dropped to his knees on the dusty floorboards. "Gideon!" She murmured, too tired to be angry, too frightened to put up her walls. "What are you doing?" He didn't look up at her face. He kept his eyes on the floor, his broad shoulders bowed. "I am begging you," he said. His voice was entirely broken, stripped of every ounce of pride, dignity, and defense. It was the raw, bleeding core of a man who had finally realized the exact price of his arrogance. "I will sign whatever you want. I will give you the London house, the country estate, half my fortune. I will dissolve the annulment or let it stand, whatever you desire. I will never ask to share your bed again. I will be your steward, your servant, your footman." He looked up then. Tears were cutting clean tracks through the dust and soot on his cheeks. "Just let me stay." He choked out his hands, gripping the edge of the mattress, as if it were the edge of a cliff. "Let me chop the wood. Let me fix the roof. Hate me for the rest of your life, Sylvia, but please do not make me live it without you. I cannot survive it. I will die." Sylvia stared down at him. The firelight flickered across his face, highlighting the deep, exhausted lines around his eyes, the hollows of his cheeks. This wasn't the stoic Duke who had handed her away. This was a man ripped open, bleeding out on the floor of a ruined house. Her abdomen tightened again, the precursor to another wave of pain. She pulled one of her hands free from the blankets. Her arm felt like lead. She let it drop over the edge of the bed. Her rough, calloused fingers brushed against his dark, messy hair. Gideon froze his breath, hitching audibly in the quiet room. "You broke me, Gideon," she whispered, her voice cracking as the pain began to build again. Tears, hot and fast, spilled over her eyelashes, soaking into the pillow. You shattered me. You don't get to glue the pieces back together just because you are suddenly lonely." He leaned into her touch, turning his face to press his lips against her scarred, dirty palm. He kissed the calluses. "I don't want to glue the pieces back together," he whispered against her skin, his tears wetting her hand. "I just want to hold them so they don't cut you anymore." The next contraction hit, ripping a scream from her throat. Gideon shot to his feet, grabbing her hands, his own fear completely forgotten as he anchored her to the earth. "I'm here," he said fiercely, leaning over her. "I'm right here. I'm not leaving. Never again." For the first time in 5 months, as the pain threatened to tear her in half, Sylvia believed him. The midwife did not arrive until the sky outside had turned pitch black. Her name was Mrs. Gable, a stout woman smelling strongly of cloves and damp wool, and she took one look at the towering, disheveled Duke standing by the bed and pointed a thick finger at the door. "Out!" she barked, rolling up her sleeves. "This is women's work, sir. You'll only be underfoot." Gideon did not move. He stood at Sylvia's shoulder, his hand still gripped tightly in hers. Her fingernails had bitten half-moon crescents into his palm, drawing faint beads of blood. "I am not leaving," he said. His voice was quiet, but it held the dense, immovable weight of cast iron. Mrs. Gable opened her mouth to argue, but Sylvia let out a low, guttural moan that dragged the argument out of the room. The next 6 hours dismantled every shred of aristocratic dignity Gideon had left. He watched the woman he had married, the woman who had quietly poured tea in drawing rooms and worn corsets tight enough to crack ribs, turn into something entirely primal. She didn't weep gracefully. She screamed. She swore at him vicious, filthy words that made Mrs. Gable cross herself. She sweat through the coarse linen sheets, her hair pasting itself to her face in dark, wet ropes. And Gideon stayed. He didn't flinch from the blood. He didn't look away from the agonizing physical reality of what her body was enduring to bring his child into the world. When Clara brought basins of scalding water, Gideon was the one who wrung out the rags, scalding his own hands to wipe the sweat from Sylvia's neck. When the pain seized her so violently that her back arched off the mattress, he climbed onto the bed behind her, letting her crush his hands, wrapping his arms around her to anchor her against the tearing agony. "I can't." Sylvia gasped, her voice entirely blown out, reduced to a dry rasp. The room smelled heavy and metallic copper sweat and the sharp tang of burning tallow candles. "Gideon, it's tearing me apart. Let me stop, please." "You can't stop," he murmured against her temple. He was crying, though he made no sound. His tears soaked into her tangled hair. "You are the strongest thing I have ever known. Break my hands, Sylvia. Break them. Just push." The final contraction ripped through the room with the force of a collapsing building. Sylvia let out a sound that belonged to an animal caught in a snare, her spine bowing as she squeezed her eyes shut. Then a sudden wet slip. The tension in the room snapped. Mrs. Gable let out a long, shuddering breath. For 3 terrifying seconds there was absolute silence. Gideon stopped breathing. The air in his lungs turned to ice. Not again. God, please, not again. He braced himself for the familiar suffocating hollow of loss. He braced himself to watch Sylvia die. Then a sharp, angry wail split the heavy air. It was a thin, reedy sound at first, but it quickly gathered strength, furious and loud. A strong pair of lungs. Mrs. Gable said, her voice shaking slightly with relief as she quickly cleared the infant's mouth. She wiped the tiny, thrashing limbs with a cloth. "And a girl. You have a daughter, sir." Sylvia went entirely limp against Gideon's chest. Her eyes were closed, her chest heaving with shallow, exhausted breaths. "A girl," she whispered. Gideon stared over her shoulder at the tiny purple screaming creature in the midwife's hands. He didn't feel a pang of disappointment. He didn't think of the alderly line or the entailment or the lack of an heir. He felt the massive, crushing weight of a boulder being lifted off his chest. "She's breathing," Gideon choked out. He buried his face in the crook of Sylvia's neck, his broad shoulders shaking uncontrollably. "Sylvia, she's breathing." Dawn broke the color of old pewter. The storm had finally blown itself out, leaving the world quiet and frozen. The bedchamber had been cleaned. The ruined sheets were stripped away, replaced by fresh, coarse linen that smelled of lye soap. The fire in the grate snapped quietly, throwing warm orange light across the floorboards. Sylvia lay propped up on 3 pillows. She felt hollowed out, as if her bones had been scraped clean, but the agonizing pressure was gone. In the crook of her left arm, tightly swaddled in a soft white wool blanket, lay her daughter. The baby was asleep, her tiny face red, and squashed a smudge of dark hair on her crown. She smelled of warm milk and iron. It was the best thing Sylvia had ever smelled in her life. The door creaked open. Gideon stepped inside. He had finally washed. He wore a clean shirt, though his hair was still damp, and he looked as though he hadn't slept in a decade. He carried a ceramic mug of hot tea. He moved with extreme caution, as if the floorboards were made of thin ice. He stopped at the foot of the bed. He looked at Sylvia, then down at the bundle in her arms. A profound, naked hunger crossed his face, followed immediately by hesitation. Clara made chamomile," he said quietly, setting the mug on the nightstand. "Thank you." Sylvia shifted, wincing as her battered muscles protested. Gideon's hands twitched at his sides. Does she have a name?" Sylvia looked down at the sleeping infant. She had spent 5 months preparing herself to raise this child alone, building a fortress of spite to keep them safe. But last night the fortress had cracked. The man standing at the foot of her bed had held her together when she was ready to shatter. "Rowan," Sylvia said. "Like the trees on the cliff. They don't snap in the wind." "Rowan," Gideon repeated. He tested the name on his tongue. He smiled, a small fragile thing that didn't quite reach his exhausted eyes. "It suits her." Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. "She isn't an heir. Gideon." Sylvia said, her voice flat, testing him. "The title will still pass to your cousin. You still need a wife who can give you a son." Gideon flinched. He walked slowly around to the side of the bed and carefully lowered himself into the wooden chair Clara had left there. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, staring at his own scarred, calloused hands. "I don't care about the title," he said, his voice scraped raw. "I don't care about my cousin, or the estate, or the House of Lords. I watched you bleed for me, Sylvia. I watched you almost die to give me a child I didn't deserve. If the Alderley name dies with me, let it." He looked up at her, his gray eyes shining with unshed tears. "I'm not asking you to come back to London. I'm not asking you to be the Duchess again. I'm asking you to let me be Rowan's father. And I'm asking you to let me fix the roof on this house so you don't freeze." Sylvia stared at him. She was too tired for anger, but the scars he had left were still deeply tender. "You annulled our marriage, Gideon. In the eyes of the law, I am a ruined woman, and she is a bastard. I will burn the paper," he said instantly. "I will bribe the bishop. I will drag Finch down here by his collar and have the documents incinerated. We will remarry in the village church tomorrow if you want. Or we won't. You can call yourself Mrs. Croft for the rest of your life, and I will be your hired hand. I don't care about the law. I care about you." He reached out his hand, trembling, and stopped an inch from the blanket wrapping the baby. He didn't dare touch them without permission. Sylvia looked at his hand. The knuckles were still split. A deep purple bruise bloomed across the back of his thumb where he had struck it with the axe. It wasn't the flawless manicured hand of a duke. It was the hand of a man who had finally learned how to bleed. Slowly she shifted the baby, exposing the tiny clenched fist resting against the wool. "You don't get to run away when it gets hard," Sylvia whispered, her voice cracking. "When she cries all night. When I'm too tired to speak to you. When the guilt of what you did makes you hate yourself. You don't get to leave." "I won't," Gideon swore. It wasn't a promise, it was a vow heavy as stone. Sylvia nudged his hand. Gideon slowly, reverently extended his index finger. The baby's tiny, perfectly formed hand reflexively opened, and her minuscule fingers clamped tightly around his bruised knuckle. Gideon let out a choked sob, dropping his head to the edge of the mattress as he wept. Sylvia let him cry. She rested her hand on his dark hair. It didn't fix the past. It didn't erase the annulment or the lonely freezing nights. But as the winter sun finally broke through the gray clouds, casting a pale tentative light across the floor, it was enough of a start. Spring arrived on the coast, not with a gentle bloom, but with a sudden violent breaking of the ice. 4 months had passed since Rowan was born. Grayling House was unrecognizable. The sagging carriage house roof had been entirely rebuilt with fresh pine that smelled sharply of sap. The shattered windows were replaced the cracks in the stone, filled with new mortar. Gideon had not returned to London. His solicitor, Mr. Finch, had made the journey once in late February, arriving with a briefcase full of panicked letters from estate managers. Gideon had met him on the gravel drive wearing canvas trousers and holding a hammer. He had taken the annulment papers from Finch's trembling hands, walked into the kitchen, and fed them directly into the cast-iron stove. "Tell them the Duke is indisposed," Gideon had told the bewildered solicitor. "Tell them he's learning how to be a husband." It wasn't a perfect reconciliation. The trauma of the separation did not vanish because Gideon chopped wood and bought flour. There were days when Sylvia woke up panicked, the ghost of the cold, solitary terror gripping her chest, and she couldn't bear to look at him. There were days when Gideon's guilt choked him so thoroughly he would go out to the cliffs and chop wood until his hands bled, terrified that he would somehow break the fragile peace they had built. They did not share a bed. Gideon slept in a small room down the hall. He earned every inch of ground he gained. One afternoon in late April, Sylvia sat on the back step, the salt breeze teasing the loose strands of her hair. The weather had turned surprisingly warm. Rowan was asleep in a wooden cradle Gideon had built himself clumsily at first, then sanded down until the wood was smooth as glass, so it wouldn't catch the baby's blankets. Gideon walked around the corner of the house. He was carrying a basket of fresh vegetables from the village market. He stopped when he saw her, the tension immediately dropping from his shoulders. He set the basket down and walked over, sitting on the stone step, a careful foot away from her. He smelled of sea salt, clean sweat, and the faint scent of the soap they bought from the local apothecary. They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the rhythmic crashing of the waves against the rocks below. "The local magistrate came to the village today," Gideon said quietly, staring out at the water. "He can perform a civil binding. It isn't a cathedral wedding. But it would give you legal protection, if you want it." He didn't look at her. He kept his gaze fixed on the horizon, giving her the space to refuse without guilt. Sylvia looked at his profile. The harsh, aristocratic lines of his face had softened. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet, grounded humility. He was no longer the man who had sat behind the mahogany desk. That man was dead. The man beside her was someone entirely new, forged in mud and panic and desperate, agonizing love. "I don't need legal protection," Sylvia said softly. Gideon's jaw tightened. "I understand. I need you to carry the cradle inside," she continued, "because my back aches, and I need you to move your trunk out of the guest room." Gideon froze. He turned his head slowly, his gray eyes searching her face wide with a sudden terrified hope. "Sylvia, it's drafty in that room," she said. She didn't smile, but the hard, impenetrable armor she had worn for almost a year finally cracked, letting the warmth in. She reached out and placed her hand over his, resting on his knee. Her calluses met his. It was a rough, imperfect touch. "And the bed in my room is large enough for two." Gideon let out a breath that sounded like a laugh, turning his hand over to weave his fingers tightly through hers. He brought her knuckles to his lips, closing his eyes as he pressed a kiss to the scarred skin. "I'll move the trunk," he murmured against her hand. "I'll move it right now." They sat on the steps a little longer, the Duke who had thrown away the world, and the Duchess who had learned to survive without it, watching the tide roll in. They were battered, deeply flawed, and heavily scarred, but as Rowan stirred in her cradle, letting out a soft, contented sigh, they were finally entirely home. Did Gideon finally earn his redemption, or should Sylvia have made him suffer just a little bit longer in the cold? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If you loved this deeply emotional journey of heartbreak, survival, and the messy, imperfect reality of earning back lost trust, hit that like button to show your support. Don't forget to share this video with a friend who loves a dark historical romance, and make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story.